I'm here to talk about my great-grandfather, Alexander Morrison Spence. Now I'm going to show you a picture. If that doesn't look like a Scottish man, I don't know who does. Anybody want to contest that? Now I'm one that I write a lot of stuff down to talk about, and then I just try to wing it. So if I get it all wrong, I've got my sister here, and I appreciate her coming to support me tonight. She really ought to be the one that's up talking, because she writes all the history. She's wrote all this stuff that I've had to learn, but I guess it's my turn to learn it. But she's going to keep me she's going to fact check me and make sure if I don't lie, because I might tell some big stories, you know. We don't tell stories about our ancestors, do we? Big, you know, little lies. But I want to tell you a little bit about Alexander, because, you know, I've heard a lot about him through my dad, and my dad was a good storyteller. But to tell you a little bit about Alexander, I got to start just a little bit earlier. And I told Ken I was going to do this. Right over here, you can see this white tall stone that says Elizabeth on the side. That is Alexander's dad and mom buried there. His name was Charles Wright Spence. He started out in Scotland. They were in Borland, Fifeshire, in Scotland. Now, I'm getting some of these wrong maybe, but they started out over there. And back in those days, the type of employment they had was mining, as you've heard. Mining was a big thing in Scotland, because back then, that's what they used to warm their houses, do all their cooking, and for their transportation, to get around in the trains and that. All that had to do with coal. So people would have to buy coal. And so there was lots of miners. Now, my great-grandfather, Charles, started out when he was 12 years old as a miner. Think about that. Alexander started out at 9 years old. Can you imagine sending your grandkids or your kids off at 9 years old, sending them down in a dark, cold mine to go down and work? And sometimes they'd work for 20 hours. Come out, sleep for 4 hours, and go back. Now, one of the jobs, I'm going to tell you a little story. Now, first of all, Alexander was born on March the 9th, 1850. So that gives you a little bit of start here. Alexander was the second of 12 kids. His one youngest sister died, and they buried her there in Scotland. The rest of them came to America. But let me tell you how they got here. When Charles Wright, the missionaries came to their home and they taught them the gospel. One of the missionaries that came there was a man by the name of Alexander Latham. Have we heard that name before, Marcine? You know, you've heard of Lathams, right? We know a lot. There's a lot of Glens, Lathams, McBrides, Archibalds, you name it. They're all Scottish people. And it's really fun. Kerrs, they're all part of Scottish. And so they all came here, and as Kent talked about, this is where a lot of the Scottish people came to reside and be together. And these guys, these people, when they got here, they liked to get together as groups and meet together a lot. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I'm going to jump a little bit, so hope I don't lose you. Charles Wright was a man that he had the missionaries come to his home, and he and his family accepted the church right off the bat. They loved the church, and they accepted it. And so for the next 20 years, they took care of the missionaries. As missionaries came to Scotland, they knew that there was always a place to stay, a place to eat, and a place to get clothing and things. And Charles took care of that for 20 years. Well, Charles always knew that the prophet had said they wanted people to come to America to colonize and to come to Zion. And that was his desire always. Now, let's bounce over here to Alexander. When Charles was baptized, Alexander was 2 years old. So from 2 years old on, he knew the gospel. And he loved it. And he could hardly wait till he could come to America to colonize and to come to Zion. Well, he had to work in the coal mines. He had an older sister by the name of Jane. And so the family decided, let's send Jane to America. We can get enough money together to send her to America. And she was told by the missionaries if she came to Salt Lake, they could find her work and she could send money to help get the family here. So they did. And Jane came over. Well, Jane didn't get here very long, and guess who she met? Alexander Latham. And they fell in love and was married. So the Spences and the Lathams now get together. So they started a family here. And while they were in Salt Lake, a year later, Charles got enough money to send Alexander to America. Alexander left the coal mines in Scotland to come to America. But before he did, I want to tell you a story that happened to Alexander while he was working in the coal mine. He was about 11 years old and he was working with his dad. And they're way deep down in the coal mine. Now, his dad had to go home for something that day. I don't know what, it didn't say what. And left Alexander there to finish loading the car because they had an order they had to get out. They had to get this coal out. And so he left his son there. Alexander was a very spiritual man. Throughout his life, as I'll explain to you later, he received spiritual blessings. He received the Spirit of the Lord telling him constantly things that happened in his life. And he was told while he was sitting there working on this coal to get out now. And he, instead of stopping and questioning it, he jumped and took off on a dead run. He got about 100 yards down through the mine when the mine caved in. It was over 100 tons of coal and rock that caved in on the mine, hitting the car that he was loading, smashing it, everything. If he would have stayed there and not heeded the promptings that he received that day, he would have not made it out alive, and I probably wouldn't be here. Now I think about that. That was just one. He tells of many, many experiences that happened in the coal mine. As you know, Sister Pickett here told us, most people didn't make it out. They didn't live past their 50s because coal mining was a horrible thing. But he ended up being a miner most of his life. Now after he left, he came across on the Colorado. Is that what it was, Jelaine? He came across on the good ship Colorado. Came to New York. Caught a train in New York and came out west. He came to Salt Lake and he met his sister Jane. And while he was there, he decided we've got to start getting money together to send back to get the rest of the family here. So he went to work as not a coal miner, but he went to work for some people up in top of Cottonwood Canyon mining for silver. While he was doing that, he had an impression that he was to leave and to go to Wyoming to work. So he left, quit his job there, went to Wyoming, not knowing what he's supposed to do. But he got to Evanston and he worked for a mine there in Evanston for a little while. He started getting some good money there, working there, and then he was given an opportunity to go to Rock Springs where they needed a seasoned miner, somebody that understood a certain process. And he went there and was hired to do this one particular job. And because of that, he was blessed to make enough money in just 4 months' time to send all of his family enough money to get him here to America. So both he could send and get all the rest of them. Now what was there, 10 left? I think there was 10 left to come over here to get to America. So what a neat opportunity. He got to work and do that. Well, when his family got to America, they came to Rock Springs, and by then he had a home there. He was kind of getting established, but there was not a branch of the church in Rock Springs. By then his sister had moved to Wellsville, Scottstown, to be with the rest of the Scottish people and started a thing here. And so Charles stayed that winter with his family in Rock Springs and loaded up that spring and brought his family to Wellsville. Now to get to Wellsville, you'd get on the train and you'd have to come all the way through the canyon, as you know, coming from Evanston, from Wyoming up through Ogden Canyon and all the way around the mountain, and they'd stop clear over here in Mendon. So when you get to Mendon, you had to walk to Wellsville. So Alexander did that a lot. And he'd get free rides most of the time because the mines were owned by the railroad company. So the railroad company, if you were a miner, they would give you free passage to ride on their train. So he got to come home quite often. When he got home, he really fell in love with Wellsville. When his dad settled here and got into a little mud house up here, and they started their home here in Wellsville, they were able to get enough money in just a short amount of time. He made over $1,400. Now that was a lot of money in those days because of this particular job that he had, and he was promised that he would do that if he'd stay close to the church. So he came, made all that money, came here to Wellsville, and he bought the land that my house is on right now, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But he bought that land right there. There was 4 acres of land there, and he bought 40 acres out by brush pile. Now, if you don't know where brush pile is, that's just the old term for maple rise. Yes. Thanks, Kent. I knew it was going to come out. I only knew it as brush pile my whole life. That's where you go pheasant hunting, and that's where the birds were. I remember out there by Bishop Horrock's house. If anybody knows Bishop Horrock's out there, that land where he is, from his down that way, that was the 40 acres that Alexander bought and owned. Well, Alexander met a young lady as he went down to Salt Lake, and he would be down there to see to some of these big groups where the Scottish would go to meet, so they could just kind of see people that they could talk with and enjoy. There he met a young lady, and he courted her and was married, and they ended up having 2 sons and 4 daughters. I'm checking. I got to make sure my sister keeps me on because all of it's written down, but I'm not going to read it because I don't like to read. Anyway, he had 2 sons and 4 daughters. Now, he had a lot going on in his life. He ended up becoming a city councilman for Wellsville. He went down and worked for the House and the Senate, and he was the timekeeper down there for 2 separate different years, which was really interesting to me. He was such a spiritual man that he was called to be a patriarch. Now, what's interesting about that was Charles Wright, his dad, was called to be a patriarch before. That was pretty special to the Spence family because Charles Wright was a patriarch, Alexander was a patriarch. Jane, if you remember Jane, the one that married the Lathams, her husband became a patriarch, and they moved up to Rexburg, Idaho. And he had 2 brothers that were patriarchs. Now, the church wasn't that big those days, and there wasn't that many patriarchs, so you can see that it stays in the family quite well. Now, in my family, my dad was a patriarch, and that was really special to me. And because I'm such a rebel, and my brother, he just doesn't listen, my sister's husband had to take the responsibility, and he's the patriarch now. So just passing it on, but it just kind of missed the Spences and over to the Kirbys just a little bit. But there's still a lot of relations in there, see? Anyway, back just for a short more. Alexander was a very special man. He had very special blessings given to him. Many times in the mines, as he worked throughout his life, he continued going to Rock Springs because that's where he made most of his money. So he was a miner many years past his age. But when his wife passed away, he stayed home and he started farming and taking care of the land that he had here and taking care of his kids. And a few years later, he met a lady by the name of Bessie Blackery, and he married her, and she had 5 kids. And so he took on those 5 kids and raised those also. But what was interesting was, because he was such a spiritual man, he would go around and he was being called all the time in the middle of the night to give blessings. This was before he was to become a patriarch. Many times, as you know, around here we had a lot of different bad diseases, and the black diphtheria was in the valley, and many people were dying from black diphtheria. And throughout the night, great-grandpa would get a phone call because he needed him to come and give the family a blessing. And he remembers coming back, and his kids wrote this down in history, that he was coming back from giving some blessings one evening, and some people came and caught him, and they says, "We need you to come over to this house and give this family a blessing." every one of them in that house had black diphtheria. They were all sick, they were dying. And Grandma Blackery says, no, you do that and you're going to bring that diphtheria here to our kids and maybe to us, and we might die. And Great Grandpa says, no, that'll never happen. He says, because the good Lord he'll bless us and we won't have these problems. Because of his faith and because of his ability to feel the Spirit, he went ahead and went and gave these people blessings. The next morning they were up and going. The black diphtheria had left that family. None of them died. And they were able to be healed. And there was no one from the Spence family got it. But yet he came home. And most of the days, most of the people back in those days, if they went around to those homes, they were all quarantined. And they weren't allowed to even go back to their homes if they were in contact with people like that. But he did. So the Lord did bless their family. Now, just in closing, I want to thank this committee that puts this together for the opportunity to be able to share about my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather, and to let you know that there was a lot of spiritual people that came across from Scotland. Scotland was a great community, great place. There was so much hardship back then for those people. I read that in Scotland there was, at one time when they started the immigration process, there was as many people in the United States that had Scottish background and in Canada than there were in Scotland. Now, think about that. That's what happened. Those people were leaving Scotland. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Scotland. I talked to a gentleman that had just been there on his mission just lately. And what's interesting is Scotland is really flourishing now. It's one of the top nations in the world as far as economy. It's a really beautiful place. They've really rebuilt it. I want to tell you just one more quick story because it affects me. Charles Wright got called on a mission to serve in the mission field in the southern states as a missionary when he got here. Alexander was married, and within just about 30 days or so, he was called on a mission to go to the southern states. Over here is a grave that's on my Uncle Charlie, and he had a son named Lynn Spence, and Lynn went to the southern states, and I had the opportunity to serve in the southern states. And I remember being in Rome, Georgia, and reading a plaque one day about these missionaries, and this one missionary got killed. And after I got home and I talked to my folks about it, I found out that my great-grandfather, Alexander, was in North Carolina when that happened. Now, the missionary got killed, and the other missionary, he was from Ogden. The other missionary was a Clausen from up here in Hiram. And the people that killed the missionary in Rome, Georgia, captured Elder Clausen, and Elder Clausen, they says that you're afraid to die, aren't you? And Elder Clausen ripped open his coat, and he just had his vest there, and he says, go ahead, shoot me, kill me, because I'm not afraid to die. And they just walked away. It's like everything was stopped. They couldn't pull the trigger, they couldn't talk, they couldn't do anything, they just left. But that same time, my grandfather, Alexander, was up in North Carolina being chased by the mobs up there and got shot at. He got shot at one time and got hit right in the heel. Didn't stop him. It did trip him up a little bit, and luckily everything was fine and he survived fine. But this is the kind of times that our ancestors went through. When I went to mission field in the South, the most I ever got was maybe bit by a dog, and that didn't feel good either. But, you know, at least I didn't get shot at. I want you to know that I love my ancestors. I want you to know I love this cemetery. I don't know if you know, but right now I have the opportunity. I took over Stan Polson's job as mowing. And there is a special feeling, I want you to know. A special feeling of being here around these beautiful headstones and these people that are buried here. Somebody said, aren't you afraid to be down here in the dark? And I says, what am I afraid of? To be around all my loved ones? I get to mow past people that I haven't seen for 50 years, and I look at their headstones and it remembers back to 50 years. It's like the best thing you can ever imagine, to be able to remember back the people that was here, the people that formed